central nervous system regulates our internal system. It integrates the information from the sensory experiences outside the body and formulates motor responses to that sensation. The central nervous system is divided into two parts. We have the cerebrum and the spinal cord. For the purposes of this course, we're really going to focus on the cerebrum and not really speak very much to the spinal cord. But know that it does have a role in our ability to interact with others, use gestures and writing and things like that. But really what we're focused on is just the areas of the cerebrum. So the cerebrum can be further divided into the cerebellum and the brainstem. So the cerebrum is kind of that gray, squishy area. Then we have the cerebellum that sits right underneath the brain. And then we have the brainstem that connects to the spinal cord. So the brain is the cerebellum. They're words that are interchangeable, and it's made up of millions of neurons that transmit information to each other. To get all of those neurons into a small space within our head, it has to squish together, and it creates areas known as gyri or sulcuses. So we have the gyri, which are those big bumps or ridges in the brain. So you'll see here kind of these white highlighted areas. These are really where all of the gray matter is housed. And then we have the sulcus or the valley that's going to help transmit information across each of these gyri. If we have a very deep valley, that's known as a fissure. So right here through the center of the brain, we have the fissure that's going to help communicate across the two hemispheres of the brain. And then those fissures also define the lobes of the brain to give us the different lobes. So the first fissure we'll talk about is the longitudinal fissure of the corpus callosum. It's going to divide the right and the left hemisphere. So when we're looking at this picture here, we have the longitudinal fissure, right? It's our long fissure going through the center of the brain, and it's dividing our left from our right hemisphere. And we know that this is our left hemisphere and our right hemisphere because this is the front of the brain. It's a little bit more pointy, generally in the cartoon depictions of the brain. And then the back of the brain is generally going to be more round. And this is when we're looking at the top of the brain from above. If we're looking at the brain from the side, you can't actually see the longitudinal fissure, but we also know that this is the left side of the brain because we have, again, that pointy area in the front, and then it kind of extends down into the back. We have the cerebellum in the back, and then back here it's a little bit more round. And so this is, again, the left hemisphere. Then we have the central fissure, or the fissure of Rolando. It's going to divide kind of the middle of the brain. So it's that deep fissure here in the middle, and it's going to give us the frontal lobe. So this kind of purplish area here in the front is the frontal lobe, and here in this picture we have the frontal lobe. Then we have the lateral fissure. The lateral fissure is only visible from the side of the head, not from the top, and it's going to give us the temporal lobe, and the temporal lobe is highlighted here in green. And then we also have the parietal lobe that sits just behind the central fissure, and the occipital lobe, which isn't defined by fissures, but it's here in the back of the brain. Now all of this information again just repeats on the right hemisphere. So we have 4 lobes on each side or each hemisphere of the brain. Now we're going to go into the different overarching or big idea roles of each lobe, but I want you to remember as we go through all of these lectures that really the lobes have individual roles, but they interact together. So the frontal lobe is really where we have our movement commands coming from in our cognition. So it's where we store our information. It has a little bit to do with memory. It has some to do with our reasoning and our ability to plan, which also goes back to our memory and our past experiences. And it also coordinates with the temporal lobe, with language, and so we have the motor cortex in the frontal lobe that's going to control the movement of muscles. So remember how we have those efferent responses that tell us to move our fingers or to move our tongue in our mouth? Those commands are all coming from the motor cortex. It also helps with swallowing to tell us that our tongue needs to move from the front to the back of our mouth to push food to the back, or to rotate the tongue in the mouth to push the food onto the chewing surface of the teeth. Then we have Broca's area, which is our motor speech center. So it's really giving us all of those small motor movement signals in the brain so that we can move our mouth and coordinate our speech into different words and sentences and things like that. So Broca's area is usually only in the left hemisphere. We don't usually have Broca's in the right hemisphere. Only 3% of the population has Broca's area in the right hemisphere, but it is just on one side of the brain. Then we have the parietal lobe, and that's really our sensory lobe. It houses the sensory cortex, so it's going to integrate the sensations of pain, touch, temperature, and pressure. And so during swallowing, it'll tell us when our food is hot or cold. During articulation, it will tell us what area of the mouth our tongue is touching. It can also help with resonation, so that we're closing and coordinating our speech sounds to send the sound through the nose or through the mouth. Or if I want a really deep voice, it's going to help change that sensation. And it helps with the control of writing. If we're trying to do big letters or small letters, we're getting that feedback to tell our motor commands to change the size of our movements for the different letters we're making. The temporal lobe houses the auditory cortex, so again, it's going to control hearing. So far we've talked about the frontal lobes, really about our movement and our cognition. Parietal lobe is about sensation. Temporal lobe is about hearing, and not just hearing the sounds, but understanding or comprehending those sounds. So the auditory cortex receives sound stimuli from the acoustic nerves and tells us what that information or sound coming in means, and that coordinates with the frontal lobe because we house our memory of sounds to tell us, okay, that's the sound of a train versus that's the sound of a car horn. And then in Wernicke's area, which is also found in the left hemisphere, it coordinates with Broca's area so that we can understand and formulate speech. So Wernicke's area is really where we're housing all of that auditory comprehension information so that we can understand the messages that we're hearing. And then it also tells us how we put our sentences together, and then that information travels to the frontal lobe where it says, all right, these are how you're going to move your articulators to shape those sounds into words. Then we have the occipital lobe, which houses the visual cortex, so its overarching role is vision. It's going to help us process our visual information. So it works with sight, not only so we have the signal to say that there's something happening in front of our face and the colors and the lights that are coming in, but it also processes the sensation of sight to tell us what it is. So I can see right now I have a desk in front of me, I have a keyboard in front of me, and I know that the desk is different from the keyboard because I can interpret that information through my occipital lobe. It's important for mostly nonverbal language, so similar to how the temporal lobe and the auditory cortex can help us give our signals to change our speech if we've made a speech error. For the occipital lobe, in users that use American Sign Language or gestures, it can help us with changing our gestures and changing our movements as it coordinates with language. It also helps with eye contact, which is our social skill, maintaining eye contact while we're speaking to somebody, and it helps with reading and writing. Of course, because we have to be able to see to read and write. The brainstem is here right in the center of the brain, and it's going to connect the brain, the cerebellum, and the spinal cord. So we have 3 divisions of the brainstem. The midbrain, and that's easy to remember because it's in the middle of the brain, and it's going to link the higher and lower centers of the brain. Then we have the pons that connects to the cerebellum, which you can't quite see in this picture, but it's going to connect the brain to the cerebellum as well as the 2 lobes of the cerebellum to each other. And then the medulla connects to the spinal cord, and so it coordinates information. It's kind of the carrier of motor commands from the brain to the spinal cord to get it out to the rest of the body. For the cerebellum, it's down here in brown at the base, just underneath the occipital lobe, and it's very important for equilibrium and body posture. And so this is going to coordinate with an area of the temporal lobe that also helps with balance, where the vestibular cochlear nerve, which we'll talk about later, helps us with our balance as we're standing and moving within space. It also helps with coordination of fine motor movements. And, as you should know, speech or articulation is a fine motor movement. So it helps us with our tone of our muscles, the speed of the movement of our muscles while we're speaking, and the range of those movements. So if we move our tongue too far forward, or we put our tongue just behind our teeth to make the s sound, but make the lisp sound instead, the cerebellum can help coordinate that. And again, it's going to work with the motor area of our frontal lobe and the sensory area of our parietal lobe to tell us how we feel that sensation coming in and giving that motor command as it goes out, and that travels down the brainstem. So hopefully that gives you kind of a big idea. This really is a coordinated system. Even though we're going to break it down into small pieces and parts, all of these pieces and parts work together to give us our big puzzle.